All right, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this special mashup with PBL Chat and Google Hangouts on Air. My name is Drew Perkins with Perkins Educational Consulting. I have a special guest today that I'm very excited to talk with and ask a lot of great questions, hopefully. It's a little daunting asking the question guy questions, but we have the author of this book, A More Beautiful Question. His name is Warren Berger. He's chiming in here from New York City, and he has a website called amorebeautifulquestion.com. Also coming up here, March 8th through 14th, he can correct me on that, is Question Week coming up, so questionweek.com as well. Without further ado, Warren, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me, Drew. Yeah, I'm a author, journalist for a long time with newspapers, magazines, New York Times, Wired magazine. More recently, more focused on books, and A More Beautiful Question is my current work. And basically, I came to that subject through writing about innovation, and I noticed that a lot of the people I was writing about, innovators, entrepreneurs, inventors, creative people of all kinds, I noticed that they often tended to be really good questioners. They were asking the questions that maybe others in their field were not asking, interesting questions. And so, and they were very good at pursuing questions long term as projects. So I became sort of fascinated by that and decided to write a book about, the importance of questioning, particularly in terms of leading to innovation and change and new ideas and things of that nature. And that became the book, A More Beautiful Question. And book is probably split between business, maybe a little more business, and then some on education and the importance of questioning in education, and a little bit on questioning in your life and why it's important to ask questions in your sort of just your daily life. So that's pretty much what it's all about.
Okay, great. And I just remind folks who are watching, I can see we have some viewers tuning in already, that this is a mashup with Twitter chat. So I believe there's a set of questions that are going along concurrently here. This is something we've not tried before, and I'm curious to see how it goes. Trying to be innovative and take some chances here. Thanks to Teresa Schaefer from New Tech Network for collaborating with me here. But you also, those of you who are viewing, should be able to ask questions and add comments. There should be a Q&A app if you're viewing on the YouTube page, and those should show up here on my screen as well. And or you can alternatively submit some questions in that PBL chat on Twitter, and Teresa will do that submission and send some of those to me as well. I'm not going to be able to watch the Twitter chat as we're going along, but so yeah, as an education consultant and working in project-based learning field quite a bit, this book really resonated with me just tremendously, because to me, when you look at project-based learning, people often ask me, so what's the essence of PBL? To me, it's really having kids creating, making, and doing things, but really teachers and hopefully students using rich inquiry to get there. So it really resonated with me, and it really was a fantastic kind of a piece. If I were teaching a teaching methods course, this would be, to me, some required reading. And I know you're not focused, your sole focus isn't on education, but one of the questions that really came to my mind was, how do teachers really work on improving their questioning skills and get that confidence to ask the right questions at the right time? What would you suggest, or what are you seeing when you're starting to visit schools, and really some of the lessons you're taking from the businesses?
Yeah, well, in education, the most interesting thing to me is maybe not about the questions that the teachers formulate, because I think a lot of teachers are really good at that, and the good teachers especially, they really put time into crafting the questions they're going to put out there in front of students, that's for good teachers that's not really an issue. That's something they already know how to do and do really well. What struck me as I did the research on this was that the much bigger transformation and the bigger issue has to do with creating an environment in a classroom where the students are going to ask more questions and better questions. And how does the teacher enable that environment? And that, to me, is really, that is a big challenge, and it's maybe something that a lot of teachers haven't maybe done that much, and they've sort of assumed and felt all along that the question formulation is really their role, and so to shift that to the students' side is a big change. It's almost like I've heard it described as a power shift, because there's almost a power shift that goes on in terms of who gets to formulate the questions, who gets to ask the questions, and when that power shift goes over to the students, that's a big adjustment. So that's one of the things I was really focused on in the book when I talked about education, was how does that happen, and how do the students get better at asking questions, and how do they get the courage to ask questions, because it can be hard for students in a classroom environment to sort of take that leap into asking questions.
Yeah, and one of the comments that popped up here from Teresa Schaefer, who is collaborating with me here, she said we have a ton of students on the chat tonight, so that's great, and hopefully they have some questions, and we'll jump in as well, because I agree with you, and we talked about this earlier today when we were chatting. We certainly want teachers asking great questions. There's no doubt about it, and that's a departure for some. It's a shift to how do you use questions as formative assessment and to guide and lead. But boy, when questions are when that role of questioner becomes what the student is doing, it really does make a big difference. So in the book you talk about, and I think this fits really well with project-based learning, the why, what if, and how method. There's I believe a question mark graphic with the why, what if, and how in there, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a little bit about that as an approach?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this may be relevant to project-based learning. I don't have expertise in project-based learning, but from what I know about it, this approach might be something that would be relevant to it. It came out of studying, again, studying innovators, studying people who are sort of, I thought of them as great master questioners, people who are, whatever their field, they're asking a lot of questions, they're tackling a lot of tough challenges, a lot of problems, and they're using inquiry to sort of work their way through. And what I found was, I found that a lot of them cycle through certain kinds of questions as they're working on a project or a problem. And they often start with why questions, because there's a need to sort of understand the problem before you can do something about it. There's a need to sort of ask why in a lot of different ways, come at the problem from a lot of different angles that usually involve, asking why or what is the problem here, and why does this situation exist? Why hasn't someone changed this before? Why hasn't someone dealt with it? Why is it important? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to me? So a lot of times the process starts with understanding, and why questions seem to be really good at helping people to dig in and understand something. And then what I saw would tend to happen is there would be another stage of questioning that was about coming up with ideas and using your imagination to really start to think about possible ways to come at the problem, and those oftentimes tended to be what-if questions because they involved a lot of speculation. They involved sort of trying out ideas in your head. You know, what if you came at it this way? What if you came at it that way? What if we looked at it in a whole different way? Or what if we combined this approach with that approach? So I found that there was this whole middle cycle where innovators would ask these what-if questions. And then eventually, the ones who are really good problem solvers would start to become more and more practical in their questioning as they went along and more focused. And then the questions would often tend to be how, because at that point they were trying to figure out, okay, I understand what the problem is. I've asked a lot of what if, I've speculated a lot on possibilities, but now I have to really kind of think about how do we move forward, how do we pick the best idea, how do we take the first steps on that to take action. In the design world, this would be the stage where they would be doing a lot of prototyping and building, and saying, well, let's try out this, let's try this model. In the science world, this would be experimenting. Let's try this experiment. So to me, that whole stage where you're sort of acting on your ideas and getting closer to a solution, that to me, I put that under the how umbrella of questioning. So I just found that when you think of questioning this way, why, what if, how, it's a nice sequence. It doesn't mean you always have to ask questions in that order, or it's not a rigid formula, but it's a nice little framework that people can use when they're confronting a problem. They can start with whys and then try to work their way to what ifs, and then their goal can be to try to get to how questions that are more practical and more specific.
Yeah, and to me that really fits absolutely perfectly in the sense of project-based learning, because when we think about ideating on a project, we want, first of all, we want to ask kids questions and ask them challenges that they're interested in solving. So sort of how do you create that cognitive dissonance? So showing them what we might call an entry event, something that really pops up and says, kids are asking those questions of like, why is it like this? Why has nobody solved this problem? That kind of thing, and that's that sort of hook. And I think you talk about in the book, I think it's transfer of ownership. It might be Dan Meyer that's talking about that, or I may be wrong on exactly who said that. But that shift there, where it becomes a problem they want to solve.
Yeah.
And one of those tricks of project-based learning really is how do we ask questions of kids that are important and exciting to them, that also get them to answer questions that are important to us, which are kind of essential questions. So that's that why stage, and then kind of ideating on, so what if, and that's where you get to that driving question and need to know list, that inquiry list where you're saying, all right, so how might we do this for this audience? Really being clear about the purpose, because that's a big why. So why am I doing that? And when I go and talk with kids in classrooms, I say, so why are you doing the work? And if they don't know why they're doing it, or it's not for some authentic purpose, then we might have some disconnects there. And then the how. So what are our next steps? What are we going to take? What actions are we going to take in order to go to that next step, to answer that question, to do this, to get to our eventual goals? So I think that why, what if, how fits really well with project-based learning.
I think it also, if I could just interject too, what it does, what it could do that might be really important for students and kids, is to show them, is to make it really clear to them that there are different types of questions that do different things, and that's so important to know. And a lot of people don't know that, even in the adult world and in the business world. One of the things I'm finding in the business world is that this idea of understanding the difference between why questions and how questions, so profound in the business world, but a lot of business people don't know it, and so because of that, they're focused on how, solving problems without ever stepping back and asking, why are we doing this in the first place, and are we really solving the right problem here?
Right.
Are we going after the wrong thing? So it's such an important lesson, I think, for kids to learn early on, that your questions really need to be, they need to come in the right order, and they need to be focused, and they need to, different questions will help you do different things at different stages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I love the word profound. I often use that when I'm talking with people in how they lead adult learning, and it's really no different with student learning. So how do you, what are the questions you might ask that get people to think profound thoughts? Because those big aha moments are really propelling and get you moving forward as you're working. And sometimes problems are really interesting to you, but over the long haul, you start to get bogged down, or you need that energy boost. So I want to go to our shift gears a little bit here. One of the questions coming in from Twitter is, when do you think we went from kids asking lots of questions, so why, like little kids, to us asking them only for answers? A little bit of that shift that kids go from asking so many questions to not so many.
Right. It's a really fascinating thing. I mean, I started to get into the research on that, and various studies that showed the number of questions kids are asking at certain ages and how it tapers off, and the peak ages being around 4 or 5 years old, and the questions are just coming in hundreds a day, and there are just so many of them, and then the tapering off starts somewhere around maybe age 6. And seems to go steadily downhill for lots of kids, not all kids obviously, but lots of them. There's a steady decline, and it's interesting to think about why that happens and what are the factors. I don't think anyone knows the full answers to it. I mean, I think it's a combination of factors. Some of it is probably biological and having to do with what's going on with our brains. And there's a term, synaptic pruning, that is used by neurologists, that has to do with our brains sort of going through this incredible expansion period and then starting to pull back a little bit at a certain age to try to consolidate some of that information we have. And so some of it probably has to do with natural things that are happening in the brain. But I think a lot of it has to do with social pressures combined with what's going on in schools. I mean, one thing you see is that kids, when they're asking those many, many questions at age 4 and 5, a lot of times they're doing it in the home, and they're doing it in a very comfortable environment. And they're asking their parents or their family members, and they're comfortable asking the questions, right? They get into a classroom, and that's when the questions start to decline, sometimes pretty quickly. And so then you'd have to ask, well, what's going on in that classroom? I would say two things. They're probably getting signals as it goes along that answers are what is really rewarded and what is really wanted. And they're also gradually getting peer pressure from other kids, that maybe questioning sort of, especially as the kids get older, questioning starts to be seen as uncool in some way, or it's not. It shows that you don't know, and you're supposed to, show that you know instead of showing that you don't know. So I think there are all of these factors, coming to bear on children in school, and they all seem to add up to giving a signal to kids that questioning is maybe not valued and not desired, and maybe there isn't enough time for it, and that you'll get more rewarded for the answer than you will for your question.
Yeah, it really is. It's such a shift that we see, and I think the graphic in your book that really resonates with me is the shift sort of corresponds in a lot of cases with the level of engagement in students, and from elementary to middle to high, you go from kids who are just excited to be at school to, man, I don't want to go to school, it's boring, to middle school, which is problematic anyway, but has its own problems as well. But then high school, and as a former middle and then high school teacher, I can attest that there are kids, students in high school, who are just angry that they have to go to school, because why would they? And so we're trying to push them to college, and so you want me to go to school more and you want me to pay for it. That doesn't seem to make sense. So any sort of lessons or advice you might give teachers and schools to, and parents really, to make make questioning more safe, more comfortable. I think it's an interesting point you make. A lot of the questioning comes in the home, but is it quality questioning, and how does that devolve as well? And we probably shouldn't use the Louis C.K.
Right.
method that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just I mean, one of the things that I was writing about this for the blog Edutopia recently, and I was thinking about, well, how do you make it safer and more how do you encourage kids to ask more questions in the classroom? And it struck me that one of the things that you've got to do is you've got to make questioning the goal instead of a distraction. So I think I really love the exercises that the Right Question Institute designed, and I'm sure there are other ways to come at this. They have one good way of doing it. There's probably lots of good ways. But I like the idea that you could maybe have a class exercise where the whole purpose of the exercise is to generate questions, and therefore, if the whole purpose is to generate questions, then what that is going to tell the kids or signal to the kids is that that's what they should be focused on. That's what they're going to get rewarded for. That is the whole point of it, and that almost never happens, right? I mean, because it would be like giving a test where all the answers are questions, or where to get the right answer you have to ask a question, right? And in effect, that's almost what needs to be done, because that's the way you're going to signal to kids or shift their behavior and their thinking in such a way to think, okay, this is the goal. Questioning is the goal, and therefore I got to work on the question, and I got to pay attention to it, and I got to put effort into it. And what they find, what the Right Question Institute has found when they do these exercises, is that when you create exercises where you're expecting and requiring kids to formulate a lot of questions, initially they are unsure. They have a little trouble at first because it's a novel thing. But what they've found is they get really into it. Once they get used to it, the idea, and they understand kind of the rules, and the rules are to generate questions, then they get really into it. And then it becomes a thing of who can ask the best question, what makes something a great question, how do I do it, how do I make my question better than the one that was just asked. And once you can get that kind of a dynamic going, then I think kids get warm up to it, they get excited, they get competitive, they get all those things get going. And I think then it's going to become a better situation. And then of course, all on top of that too, or alongside of that, you have to obviously have a lot of tolerance for questioning. You have to sort of get across the idea that you're not going to get laughed at if the question seems naive or something. So that has to be expressed as well. And and then as I said, maybe the ultimate goal is to make questioning cool somehow. And if there's a way to do that in the classroom, and one of the things I mention is that kids should know that a lot of these gadgets they love, and a lot of the artists, the musical artists maybe that they admire, and a lot of the things and the people that they admire are questioners or came out of questioning, so that there's a coolness element to this, because it ends up creating really great stuff in the world. So I don't know. I mean, I think if there's a way to somehow convey that idea, that might help too. What we're really trying to do is overcome some of the stigma that is attached to questioning, and it's not easy.
Yeah, you really. You're hitting on, it's a culture issue, it's a culture shift. I think that one of the things our schools have had to buy into, what I call a culture of achievement, which is really heavy on accountability and test scores and sort of the end result, as you mentioned, sort of a lot of answers,
Right.
answers reign, answers are the king, to what needs to happen is a culture of teaching and learning, which is really getting to heavy inquiry, and as Teresa Schaefer, one of the questions was, how do you advise getting students or teachers to stay in the question? How do you foster that culture of curiosity? You know, when kids stop playing school, so that homework and the work that they're doing in school isn't for points. I remember doing a Socratic seminar, and when I had kids started doing that, they were saying, all right, so, you know, I'd say, so you need to add your thoughts or questions at least 4 times or something like that, and they'd say something and instantly turn to me and say, "Did I get my points?"
Right.
No. It's not about points. And so when
Yeah.
you remove that, and they get into that intellectual, the academic engagement part of it, I think it really becomes really it is a shift that needs to happen, and it needs to be valued, and needs to be valued differently. We have a question from Ryan Smith in Round Rock, Texas, outside of Austin. He says, how do the answers to questions from teachers, leaders, managers drive or squash inquiry? And so I'll read that again. So how do the answers to questions from teachers, leaders, managers drive or squash inquiry? So have you seen anything in that respect? Like what kind of answer kids ask you questions, you know?
Well, I think one of the great things that you can do is answer questions in a way that generates a new question, and sort of as opposed to giving just a flat answer as if that's the end of the story. Anytime someone can give an answer and then build on it with a question that takes it even further, it's a way to sort of model for kids that questions don't necessarily just have simple answers. Sometimes there are levels to all this, and you can go deeper and deeper. And I think that's one of the ways that answers can encourage more questioning. Obviously, one of the ways that answers can discourage questioning is if the answer is given in such a way that, and this is true whether of bosses as well as teachers or anyone in authority, if the answer is given in such a way that it suggests you should have known this already, or that's an obvious question, anytime that kind of signal is put out there, it's going to be very detrimental to questioning, because it's going to send that message like, gee, you should have known this already, and why do you really even have to ask, So anytime that message is put out there, obviously that is going to fuel, or that's going to sort of squash questioning a little bit. I think that the whole thing with questioning is that it's all, a lot of it is about tone. It's very subtle. A lot of it is about when you answer a question, does your tone suggest that you appreciate the question or not? Or are you answering it in kind of a rote way, or are you answering it in a tone that may be slightly annoyed or rushed, as if, gee, I just want to move on. We really got to move on, but I'll give you a quick answer. So that tone will tell a lot to people about whether their question is appreciated or not. And tone is also very important in the asking of questions. It's one of the things I talk about a lot in the business world. The term appreciative inquiry, where the way that you word a question is so important in terms of turning it into a positive question or a negative question, and it will have a huge effect on how people respond to the question. I think a lot of times questions, it's interesting, we have to be a little careful with questions. Questions are sometimes perceived as a challenge, and it can be true with the teacher asking the student, and it can also be true of the student asking the teacher. Both can feel like a little bit threatened almost by a question sometimes. So it's really important to model and teach that questioning has to be asked respectfully and with genuine curiosity. And I think that's really important because that will take some of that edge, some of that challenging, aggressive edge off of questioning.
Yeah. I think the term that you used in the book that that I liked was precocious, being just asking questions just to be precocious,
Yeah.
which is different than asking
Yes.
appreciative, good, rich questions. So
Right.
nobody's saying we want to just ask questions just to challenge status quo and be a pain in the butt.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
there's a
and
big
people
difference there.
sometimes get in the habit of questioning that way, and it's not a good habit to get into. It would be great if we could sort of catch that habit early on, the habit of being sort of the questioner who is there to be a devil's advocate or maybe irritate people or show people up, that kind of thing. You see that kind of use of questioning a lot in adults in the business world, and it's oftentimes not productive. And the most productive kind of questioning is questioning that is just genuine, authentic, and it's rooted in curiosity. I mean, a question is a good question as long as you really want to know the answer.
Yeah, that's a really great way to phrase it. And so, kind of back to that safety question here, because another question coming in about how do we make our classroom culture where it's safe to ask questions and for teachers to not know the answers. So I'd like to get you to talk about that, but also one of the things that you mentioned, we talk about the stigma of questioning, certainly the coolness of it, but a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about a lot until reading it was some cultures. It is expressly taught by their parents to not question
Right.
because it's expressly not safe. So if you would talk about that a little bit, as well as how do we create that culture and for teachers to not know the
To
answers,
not
because I
know,
think
yeah.
that's a big
I,
yeah.
I love that idea of the teachers being comfortable not knowing the answer. I know it can be a little risky, because and again, is a great parallel to the business world. A lot of company leaders, CEOs, are grappling with this issue. Is it okay for them to not know? Is it okay for them to not know the answer and to admit that in front of their employees? And I think the teachers have the same issue. Is it okay to admit not knowing in front of students? And I mean, what you see in the business world certainly is that it's actually really refreshing when someone in leadership or authority admits that they don't have all the answers. It has a very positive effect, surprisingly. Most people are afraid it's going to undermine authority. It seems to do just the opposite, especially if you do it with some fun and confidence, because what you can do is once you admit that you don't have all the answers, it almost can segue right into an invitation to students or employees or whoever you're working with to sort of help you or to join you on a journey, to find out. And it becomes a really it creates a really interesting collaborative experience there. So I think it's an interesting idea for teachers to think about, and as I say, a lot of CEOs are thinking about this too. How can I show some vulnerability and use it in a way to show a positive way to show kids there's a lot to learn out there, and I don't have all the answers, and we can learn together. We can do this together, and it'll be even more fun. So that's one thing. And then now going to the other point about the cultural issues, a huge issue. I mean, different cultures, and it's not even like different countries, it's different cultures within our country. It's different classes, it's different backgrounds, will have different or may have different attitudes toward whether it's okay to question authority or whether it's okay to ask questions in a certain kind of environment. And I think we need to be very conscious of that. I had one teacher, talk about the fact that and I've actually discussed this with some researchers too who are looking into this, the idea that sometimes if kids are coming from a disadvantaged background, it's going to be even more challenging for them to ask questions because they may feel that they're at risk of being seen as disruptive or living up to some stereotype that they're worried about or something like that. There are issues that even maybe not even on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, they may feel that they have more to lose by asking questions than the child who comes from a more advantaged background, who maybe feels a little more confident that about his role in the world and where he fits in this classroom and all that. That child may not have any issues with raising his or her hand and asking as many questions as they want, but another child from a different kind of background, there may be more risk involved. So I think we have to be conscious of all of those cultural issues and how it would be really great to, especially if we can help those kids who might be dealing with those challenges, if we can help them to ask questions freely and without fear, that would be a huge thing, because especially if we see, as I'm contending in the book, that that ability to question is going to help them be very successful in the business world. And so if we can early on help them overcome that, whatever those obstacles are, if we can help them overcome that, we're actually doing a lot toward what might help them later on in the business world.
Yeah, those at-risk kids, I think it's really just a great point, because that they have often been told, respect the teacher,
yes,
or don't
behave.
ask questions. Yeah, behave otherwise, because you ask questions, you're going to get in trouble. That
Exactly.
means,
right. And they may also be in larger classes where there's even less tolerance for questioning, and understandably, because the teacher is trying to deal with a lot of chaos or a lot of pressures, even more so than in other classes.
Yeah, and the sort of flip side of that, I think, and you make this really good point as well in the book about, and I think one of the ways to change that culture is to reward questioning and really work on it and teach it, use it as a formative tool, use it as a teaching tool, and at some point, if we have time, I'd like to talk about, I think the last name is Hackett from Steelcase, who talks about scaffolding around problems is made up of a lot of questions, and that's, I think, a really difficult concept for a lot of teachers. Inquiry is an enigma for a lot of teachers. But one of the things that you point out, and I think is a profound moment for me, was if you ask kids to not give you answers but to give you questions. Every kid has questions. There's a lot of kids who don't have the answers.
Right.
So
Exactly.
It's easier to give those questions and express your thinking. It's much more intimidating to say, but I don't have the answer, and so I'm a failure.
Yeah, that's what's so great about one of the things that I'm looking into in businesses, and it comes out of what the Right Question Institute has done in schools, is the idea of sort of brainstorming in questions. And one of the interesting things you find when you brainstorm in questions is that, again, it may seem a little strange to people at first, but once they get in the rhythm of it, they actually feel much freer to ask questions than they do to give answers, because there's always the fear that the answer you're giving might be wrong, or that if you're trying to put an idea out there, that it might be a bad idea. With questions, there's a little more freedom. People don't necessarily worry about asking the wrong question. They don't really. That's not a great fear that a lot of people have. So they're more willing to put, once they get in the rhythm of it and they get used to it, they're more willing to put questions out there. So what you find in a question storming session in the business world is that you tend to get more participation from more people. Whereas in the typical brainstorming session that involves coming up with ideas, only the most confident people are going to be the ones that are putting a lot of ideas out there. So it ends up being really, really democratic. You know, it really there's something very democratic about questioning, because everyone feels they can ask questions, but not everyone feels that they have great ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a question here from Ellen Sears that I'd like to pose, and I'd also like to remind folks, because I see we have a good number of viewers, and thank you all for tuning in, and those folks on Twitter chat hopefully are joining us too. But if you are watching, please take advantage of that Q&A app and add your questions here, because we'd like to pull in some of those. But Ellen asks, we assume it is about questioning, but what needs to be in place to support growth in questioning, such as observation skills, recognizing patterns, making connections, those kinds of things for all learners, so meaning
Yeah,
teachers and students?
yeah, yeah. I think that's a great point. You know what you find when you study great questioners is that they are observers. They're really good listeners. They really pay attention. They pay attention to whatever it is they're sort of studying. Um, they will force themselves to pay attention to things that other people are not paying attention to. And so, you know, they kind of get in the habit of looking at familiar things and giving them a second look and looking at them a little more closely. So these are all habits that go with being a good questioner. And I think to the extent that we want to produce or we can produce better questioners, we need to try to teach some of those habits and try to encourage some of those habits and let people understand that those things go with those kind of behaviors, you know, listening, observing, um, spending time thinking, reflecting on something. Those kind of things go hand in hand with good questioning. They often feed good questioning, and questioning also there's a back and forth relationship. Questioning helps you do those things. You know, questioning helps you to observe, because you bring, as you're observing, you bring the skill of questioning to bear on what it is you're observing. So I think that's a great point, and those are behaviors that we need to sort of teach and show students that those things will help them become better questioners. I think patience is a big thing too. I mean, one of the things I think is that you know, we're in a culture now where it's like instant answer, right? You know, so you have a question and you get the instant answer on Google or wherever, and so we're getting a little bit conditioned to think that all the answers to our questions are just a couple of keystrokes away. And so I think one of the important things to teach about questioning is that there are different levels of questioning and different types of questions. And some questions can be answered very easily on Google, and that's great. That's really useful, and we should use Google for that. But then there are other types of questions that cannot be answered simply and easily on Google. They're deeper questions. You have to spend time with those questions, and you have to pursue them. And I think it's a wonderful thing to pursue those kinds of questions. It's, you know, that's what I call beautiful questions. You know, the kind of questions that you can spend a lot of time on, and they're really challenging, and they can lead you on a journey. And I think if we can get students excited about those kinds of questions, the kinds of questions you can't answer on Google or on Wikipedia, if we can get students excited about those kinds of questions, that's pretty great. That's going to lead them on you know, a whole different kind of journey.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, what you're describing in my mind is really great project-based learning, because we want to make a shift. You're talking about some art and science of teaching and questioning. We want to make a shift from of teaching strategies and approaches. But again, one of the things that sometimes happens when we're working in project-based learning is we design a challenge that's not engaging, it's not interesting, it's not a worthwhile question. And then none of those habits, none of those things that you're talking about become really
Right.
exciting to do, and they're not relevant, so they're much harder to teach, which is why, high schoolers are sometimes very hard to teach because they're disengaged from the work, and there's no reason for them to do it other than for playing school. So kind of getting back to the question that Ellen made, it reminded me, she talked about making connections, and you also talked about connective inquiry, which I
Yeah.
think is a really interesting piece. I think it's important for students and teachers to be resourceful as learners. And can you talk a little bit about that connective inquiry concept?
Yeah, I see going back to that, if we go back to that model of why, what if, and how questions, to me, connective inquiry happens in that middle stage of what if. Um, it's the stage of it's the type of questioning. There's a whole type of questioning that involves um, using our imagination, um, speculating, using bits of information that we have and connecting them in new ways, and all of that stuff really happens a lot when you're in that sort of what if mode of questioning. It's basically, what if I take this idea from over here, and what if I marry it with this other idea from over there? That is the source of innovation in the world. I mean, you can look at almost any innovation, and you will find someone did some version of that. They sort of connected something that was already there with something else that was already there, and they brought it together in a new way. So I think the idea of connective inquiry is really exciting, and again, I just think it's something that if we can convey the power of that to young people and the excitement of it, I mean, it's the kind of thing that they will love, because one of the great things about connective inquiry and the whole idea of connecting ideas is that it teaches us that to invent and create, we don't have to create from scratch. We have these amazing materials at our disposal in terms of knowledge and things that already exist. And our job, what we have to do, is figure out how to bring them together in a new way. And it's, to me, what's beautiful about that is it makes invention seem much more possible. Because when I think I have to invent something from scratch, from dust, and it seems very intimidating. But when I think that I could invent something just by mashing up two things that already exist, suddenly that becomes a lot more possible and a lot more realistic. So that's where I think connective thinking is great, and I use connective inquiry just as a term of, when you're doing that kind of connecting, you're asking a lot of questions. You're asking, what if I do this, or what if you put A together with B, what'll happen then?
Yeah, and so kind of getting back to that scaffolding around problems is made up of a lot of questions quote that Mr. Hackett from Steelcase put out there. It goes really well with a question here that was posed again by Ryan Smith. So if teachers are not good at questioning their leaders, then they will not bring that environment into their classroom. How can campus or organizational cultures celebrate and grow deep inquiry into questions you can't Google? And to me, that's a real connection to that scaffolding around problems that is made up of a lot of questions. But that's getting into that real enigma and difficulty of in-depth inquiry. So, how do you see that scaffolding around problems being supported by questions, not by answers?
Mm. Well, I think what Jim Hackett was saying is that, and he's the head of Steelcase, was that a lot of times his company is dealing with very complex problems that are going to have to be solved and addressed in stages, and no one's going to come up with an answer right away, and no one's going to come up with one question that's going to lead to an answer right away. So what they have to do is, and I love that term scaffolding, but they have to almost surround the challenge and build all around it. And it's almost like, climbing a mountain, and they've got to figure out which way they're going to go up and how they're going to get up, and it's all done through questioning. I mean, questioning is what gets you from the starting point to a little further up, because you start to, through the right questions, you start to figure out some of the basic things you need to know. And then as you continue to question and continue to build that scaffolding of questioning, you're learning more and more about, what are the issues here we need to deal with, what's important, what do we know, what do we not know. And so there's a whole process of trying to get deeper and deeper into the challenge that is all done through great questioning. And I think what Hackett was trying to teach his people is that they need to think of their questioning as the tools that are going to help them really take apart these very, very complex problems that otherwise might seem very daunting and unapproachable. And you need the questioning to help you sort of scale up that side of that problem.
Yeah. And so in a project-based learning environment, we have that need-to-know list, that inquiry list. And one of the things that I try to work with teachers heavily around it, and it is a shift. It's a real metacognitive shift, how you, as a teacher, use those questions as a lever for critical thinking. Because, as you said, to ask good questions, you've really got to think about a lot of different things and pieces. So getting that piece put in, I think, is difficult, but really super, super important. There's another piece that Jim Hackett that you quoted him on that I thought was really interesting as a way to get at quality engagement in PBL. He said that people have to learn how to find the tensions in the arguments. Which I thought was a really interesting way to think about that, because cognitive dissonance and a challenge that's worth tackling, and a question that's worth answering and considering. So, what do you think he meant by finding that tensions in the arguments, and how do we do that?
Well, I think what he's saying is we tend to think that there are easy answers to our questions. Something's either right or wrong, or the answer is either A or it's B. And what he is teaching there is, the idea that a lot of times there's a tension between different ideas, and if you understand that tension, you start to understand what the real challenge is. In his world, in the business world, some people might be saying, oh, we need to focus on this aspect of the business, and someone else is saying, no, we need to pay more attention to that aspect of the business. And what he is saying is that there is a tension, there's a reason why they're disagreeing, and there's a reason why the answer is probably somewhere between them, and it's somewhere in that tension between them is where we are really going to find a solution. It's not that one person's right or the other person's right. There's an answer somewhere in between, and so we have to use questioning to sort of understand that middle ground and that whole area in between people there. And I think it's true in terms of great questioning. Any complex issues that we might be teaching kids. It's not always about a simple answer. It's about what is the reason why this happened, and what were the forces that led this particular thing to happen, or created this issue, or what are the forces driving this problem that exists in the world today, or what are the forces behind this problem we're looking at or trying to solve. And I think that's where the understanding the tensions, understanding the dynamics and the forces that cause things to happen, that's where the real beautiful answers lie. But you have to ask beautiful questions to reveal those tensions.
Okay. So we have about 5 minutes here, and I'd like to start wrapping up. And again, we have a little time to, if anybody wants to throw some questions in that Q&A app or through the Twitter chat. Um, to me, there's a lot, as you said at the beginning, the book is not focusing solely on education, but there's so many great lessons. Um, the book talks a lot about business and some of the big leaders of folks who are industry giants and
Right.
Google and some of those places that we all value and treasure. Uh, but they have a little bit different, sort of that fail quickly attitude, the startups, the innovation I think we want to have that in education, but
But it's
well,
harder sometimes.
yeah, well, it's harder. It's harder because the stakes are different. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if money comes and goes, but we can't afford to just have a school fail because
Yeah.
the obvious consequences. So, what would you say are some of the lessons from business that we might bring into to the hierarchical structure or the structure of schools and classrooms in general?
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at businesses that are embracing that sort of fail fast model, um, you have to understand that there's a lot of risk for them too. I mean, they don't want to go out of business, and so what they have to figure out is what is acceptable failure, and what is the kind of failure that really doesn't have long-term consequences. It only has short-term consequences. It's a temporary setback that we can overcome very quickly, and it'll help us. It'll help us get smarter because we will learn from that temporary setback. And that's a whole sort of movement that has taken hold in the business world that basically says you have to be experimenting and trying stuff very quickly, and you have to be learning on the fly, and that will help you to get smarter and better at business. Now, you have to understand what you can fail at and what's too important. And you can't fail at it because it'll be devastating, it'll drive you out of business, and nobody wants that. So what business has gotten very good at is figuring out how to do small failures, the kind of failures that are actually positive because you learn from them, but they're not devastating, and they don't cause like permanent damage or lasting damage. And I think there's a lesson in there for the education world. The idea that if in the education process we can figure out how to do experimentation that is not going to hurt, not going to do the kind of devastating damage if it doesn't work, but it will allow us to keep learning and adapting new methods as we go along. So we can come up with failures that are tolerable and failures that are actually positive because we'll learn from them. So I think that's a lesson. It's also a lesson that if we can somehow impart that to the kids, that there are ways to have small failures in your life that are actually going to help you. And it's okay. It's okay to experiment, and it's okay to try things. And if they don't work, that's not necessarily devastating because you can learn from those small failures. And this is how Steve Jobs got to where he was. I mean, he got there through small failures and through figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and then advancing every step of the way. So I do think there are a lot of lessons about learning through failure. And I think of I don't even like to use that word failure because what it really is that it's really just experimentation, and it comes back to questioning and basically saying what if I try this, and what will happen if I take this approach, and being willing to try that, and knowing that it may not be exactly right, but you're going to learn something when you try it, and you're going to pick up some new knowledge and some new skills, and then you're going to try again, and you'll be smarter the next time you try.
Yeah, I think learning is the operative word there. So failure as a learning opportunity absolutely fits in with what we want to see in education. So we've got to wrap up here, and I'm getting some really good feedback on Twitter that folks really enjoyed this mashup. So thank you for submitting to being a part of this.
Sure. Great.
And
I just want to, Drew, I just want to cut in with another reminder about Question Week.
Yeah, I wanted to let you talk about that and your Edutopia and your book website and those kinds of things.
Okay, just a quick thought on Question Week. You know, we just decided, myself and there's a couple of other organizations that are very big on questioning, and we just thought it would be fun to just have a week where we just promote the idea of asking a lot of questions in classrooms, in companies, and so we created a website. There are some exercises on there, questioning exercises you can try. There are things you can maybe do in a classroom or maybe do in an office. And there's lots of articles and books and resources all about the power of questioning. So worth checking out. The site is questionweek.com. And you know, I urge people to check it out and spread the word.
And I scheduled a tweet in the 21st century here. I see it's gone out, and so hopefully folks will check that out. Questionweek.com. The book website is amorebeautifulquestion.com, right?
Right.
And so for educators as well, there's an Edutopia article that you may or may not have seen, but please check that out. And some of Warren's other work. Are you writing just for Wired or just Fast Company? I read both of them, so I think both of those.
I write for a lot of different publications. There's no one. I'm not connected, you know, particularly to any particular one. Write for lots of publications. Right now, I'm totally focused on the subject of questioning. And I probably will stay with it for a while because it's a great subject, and I can see going in a lot of different directions with it.
And so a good question here before we go. What's the hashtag for Question Week?
I believe it's hashtag Question Week.
I think it is. I think because I tweeted it out a little bit earlier, and it's on the website if you haven't been there. I think it is hashtag Question Week. So thanks, Teresa, for that reminder. Thanks so much, Warren. Again, folks, if you haven't read the book, please make sure that you get it. It's, I think, a great resource. Really brought a lot of great questions to my mind, and to me, that's a huge value. I'm looking forward to rereading it and using it. I've got mine. You can see all my my bookmarks in here. We've got some other questioning things coming up. I'm looking at scheduling a hangout with the folks from the Right Question Institute, so look forward to that, and please feel free to follow me at dperkinsed and visit me at perkinsed.com. And until next time, we'll see you. Warren, anything else you want to say?
No, that's it. If people want to follow me, I'm at GlimmerGuy. On Twitter, I'm at GlimmerGuy.
All right. Well, thanks so much, and thanks to everybody. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.